Let's go to our guest line. Bring on our first and only guest today. It's Monday, 12:30. That means it's time for Mike McAllister. Mike, how was your weekend?
That was not too bad. How was yours?
It was good. A nice comeback by the Bills yesterday, and unexpected fashion, doing it with the defense. So no, it was a good end to the weekend. Big news to start the weekend, right? With this news that Vince Karras will join Syracuse as the new defensive coordinator. Let's start right there, and just your overall thoughts about him coming from Toledo, where he had a lot of success, and being the leader of this defense here.
I don't think you can argue with the just raw numbers, right? I think they were second or third in the country in total defense and right around there in terms of points allowed per game as well. Played pretty good defense when they were playing on the road at Kentucky, so at an SEC school where you figure talent-wise they'll be overmatched, and yet they represented themselves pretty well there. So I think he comes with great pedigree. He comes with a lot of success, and a lot of other schools wanted him. So the fact that Syracuse was able to get him, I think that speaks highly to Syracuse's commitment to football from a financial perspective. And then once again, Fran Brown doing a good job at attracting talent at areas of need.
What do you think about the fact that, by all accounts, he'll stick with that 4-2-5, hybrid style that we're used to seeing? Do you think it's a fit for Syracuse?
I think it can be, but, I think it depends on, some other factors. The talent that you have, especially on the defensive line, is such a key to that. And then how you approach it just from an aggression standpoint. I thought they showed flashes of being a team that could kind of mix up their blitz packages and how they pressured opposing quarterbacks, like the game against Pittsburgh that I'll reference. And then there were times when I thought they were a little bit too passive and just trying to get home with that front four and weren't creative enough trying to generate pressure. So as that Syracuse defensive line gets better, I think the scheme will get better as well. But there's no question that he comes with the pedigree of being really stingy defenses that get after the quarterback, force turnovers, and they keep teams out of the end zone, which Fran said is the number one thing moving forward.
Karras is one of two new coaches that have been hired in the last couple of days. What about this new offensive line coach, Juan Castillo? Lots of NFL experience, including with your team, the Philadelphia Eagles. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, when I first heard the name, I was like, wait a minute, is that the same guy who was the offensive line coach the entire time that McNabb was in Philly, which is kind of when I started becoming a Philadelphia Eagles fan. So that kind of took me back a little bit. And they always had really, really good offensive lines during that time when they were one of the best teams in the NFL, seemingly year in and year out. So I think the fact that they were able to land someone with that long lineage of pedigree and successful pedigree is a good thing. Now, I understand that it didn't go that great at UCLA, which was his most recent full-time college job in terms of being the actual offensive line coach and not just an assistant offensive line coach. But let's be real. It didn't go well basically anywhere under Deshaun Foster at UCLA. That was just a complete train wreck. So given his history and his 40-plus years of being a good offensive line coach, it's easy to kind of forgive that little blip. But hard to argue with the resume that he brings to Syracuse.
Mike, do you know what's changed at Syracuse? The three of us all grew up in this area and watching this, and we were told you couldn't afford coaches here. You could, I pushed that narrative. What do you think has changed with Syracuse financially that's allowing all this to happen?
Well, I think the fact that they had the good first year under Fran Brown, and when he took the job, I'm sure there were some discussions about what the financial commitment would look like in order to attract the type of coaches that he wanted. And the fact that people rallied around him, I think, is a huge part of it. But then at the same time, as much flack as John Wildak gets for various things, I don't think they have the purse strings open the way that they do in order to get some of these coaches, if not for his effort. So I think he deserves a little bit of credit in this whole thing as well. It's clearly a commitment right from the top down in terms of wanting to be able to attract the best coaches that you can, not only from the head coaching perspective, but all the assistants as well.
He brings in a couple new coaches. He also lost a couple coaches over the weekend as well. Elijah Robinson off to LSU, Nick Williams off to Florida State. Both guys are very good at what they do, and recruiting in particular. How will they be missed? How much will they be missed? And how does Fran go about replacing what they do in the recruiting world?
Well, anytime you lose really good recruiting assistants, that's certainly something you're going to have to account for and adjust. But at the same time, that's kind of what Fran Brown's bread and butter is, right? Is recruiting and attracting talent and the relationships that he develops. So perhaps there's just a change in philosophy in terms of, I don't need ace recruiters at every single position. Perhaps I need more player development guys, some better X's and O's guys at some positions, because they complement the skill set that I bring to the table. And then, they can kind of have a more well-rounded staff. I don't know if that's the case. That's just something I've kind of thought of when you take a step back and look at where the production has been or hasn't been on the defensive side of the ball, some of the changes that are being made, and where they could use some upgrades. That's certainly defensive line has certainly been an area that's been a bit up and down over the last 2 years. So you wonder if perhaps they bring in some guys that are, more established from an X's and O's and player development standpoint, and that will complement what Fran Brown brings to the table from a recruiting standpoint.
Mike, I think the last time we talked to you, we were sweating out the Kelvin Russell issue with him pushing back his signing. Do you know what happened there and what led him to actually making the decision?
I don't have any more specifics other than kind of what's been out there, which is the reporting and the rumors were that there were a few schools that called him late, on Tuesday and tried to change his mind. And he just kind of wanted to take a step back and just sort of double check and make sure that he really did, Syracuse was really the home for him and came to that conclusion. I wasn't as concerned necessarily that he was going to end up signing with another school. I know Michigan and Miami were two of the schools that were mentioned when he first said he wasn't going to sign that day. But everything that I had heard was that neither of those schools were realistic options for him. And it sounded like LSU and Florida might have been a couple of schools that were among those pushing for him, Florida State a little bit as well. But most of those schools were already there when he originally committed to Syracuse. When you're looking at the Michigans and the Miamis and the Florida States and those types of schools, the Floridas and the LSUs were a little bit different just because they had coaching changes. The thing that I kept coming back to, though, is when looking at LSU in particular, if Lane Kiffin really wanted Kelvin Russell, wouldn't he have been recruiting him extremely hard at Ole Miss? And that really wasn't the case, right? So it seemed to me to be more of, Lane Kiffin trying to make a little bit of a splash as opposed to, we really want you and we have a plan for you, et cetera. And I think ultimately when Kelvin Russell took a step back and just, kind of thought about things, he came to the same conclusion and ultimately decided to stick with Syracuse.
Mike, what do you think is a realistic expectation of Kelvin Russell in year one, just as an athlete at Syracuse University, right? Because we heard he wants to play basketball as well. What's a realistic expectation for his freshman year across the board?
Heisman Trophy, I think, right?
Yeah.
I mean, listen, there's going to be some that are going to think that, right? They're just naturally going to think Kelvin Russell, 5-star, he should come in and be one of the nation's best receivers right away. I don't think that's fair for anyone coming out of high school because you just never know how players are going to adjust, how long it's going to take them to adjust. Now, I'm expecting him to be in some capacity in the wide receiver rotation. I don't know that I necessarily expect him to start. I think he could. It really depends on who stays, who leaves, who else do they attract in the transfer portal at the wide receiver position. We just don't know what that group looks like yet. But I think he's going to be in the mix in some capacity. He'll see the field. From a basketball standpoint, I'm not really sure what to expect from him. I haven't seen as much of him in terms of what he brings to the table, but I think he'll be someone that'll make him better in practice. He'll compete, and he'll be someone that, at least for year one, is kind of on the back end of the bench and maybe gets in some garbage time minutes.
What is the rate of he was a 5-star, I think, until Syracuse got involved, right? What is the rate of success of 5 stars translating to the Power 4, would you say?
I guess it depends on what you mean by success. Do you mean that he's starting and contributing in some way? If that's the case, I think it's pretty high. You're probably talking 75% plus at that point. If you're talking fulfilling the expectation that you're going to be a superstar, it's probably less than that, somewhere in the 30 to 50% range, somewhere in that range. But that's kind of guesswork on my end, but that's just kind of what my impression is. But I think it really depends on what you determine success is. And I also think that changes depending on the position, right? Because if you're a 5-star quarterback, if you're just a solid Power 4 starter and you're not a superstar quarterback, I think many are going to view you as a disappointment at the college level. If you're a wide receiver, let's say you're Kelvin Russell or a Kelvin Russell type, and you go to a Power 4 school and you're a starter for 3 years and you put up solid numbers, and then you end up getting either a late NFL look, NFL draft look, or you're an undrafted free agent, you get a training camp invite, and you're just sort of a above average player at the collegiate level, some may view you as a disappointment. I'm not sure I would at that point. So I think position plays a part in terms of what you view as a success as well. But most of the time, the 5 stars end up being a contributor in some fashion.
What do you make of the Malachi James news that he's hitting the portal? And if you read between the lines on his announcement, it almost sounded like he didn't want to leave, but was maybe shown the door. I mean, what do you make of that situation?
That's certainly the way it sounded. And then I found it interesting with the number of coaches that he thanked in that post that he didn't mention the head coach. So I found that a little odd, and maybe that's further evidence that he was asked to leave. I'm not 100% sure on exactly what happened there, but listen, he's got a lot of ability. I think there's a very high ceiling there. I think his speed is about as elite as it gets, right? He's a track star. He contributed from that perspective, but he's struggled staying healthy as well. So I'm not exactly sure where the fault is, whether that's a training thing, whether that's a diagnosis thing from a training staff perspective, what the issue is. But he certainly struggled with injuries. And so the hope is when he goes to his next home that he'll be able to stay healthy and see the fields and he'll be productive.
All right, one last big picture football question before we touch on basketball. Do you think the committee got it right ultimately? Had, 2 spots for 3 teams? They went Alabama, Miami. Notre Dame's left out. Notre Dame's very upset. Do you think the committee got it right ultimately?
I think probably. I would have swapped Notre Dame for Bama for my own personal choice of, maybe not quite having it be the SEC Big Ten Invitational and having, another, I know they're independent, but someone other than those 2 conferences represented a little bit more. But when you look at the resumes next to each other, despite the fact that Alabama has 1 more loss, they're basically ahead of Notre Dame in all of the other metrics that they look at: strength of schedule, strength of record, all of those types of things. The thing where I think Notre Dame has a gripe, I don't think they have a gripe necessarily when comparing themselves to Miami specifically, because their metrics and their resumes are nearly identical. They have the exact same record, but Miami won head-to-head. So in my opinion, that should put them in over Notre Dame. Where Notre Dame has a gripe is that's been the case for several weeks, and the committee has seemed to try putting those 2 teams against each other and elevating Miami above Notre Dame for whatever reason, and then they do it in the very last selection show that determines which schools actually go to the playoff. I understand why Notre Dame and Notre Dame fans would be upset by the fact that it felt like the rug was pulled from underneath them a little bit with the way that they did that. So I think the committee didn't do things the best way, the most honest way, if I'm being frank, in terms of the way they did things throughout the entire process. Ultimately, I think the final teams, my biggest gripe would have been I would have put Notre Dame in front of Bama, but I also understand why Bama was left in.
Yeah, I firmly believe if Virginia had won the ACC that Notre Dame would be in. And I feel like the fact that Virginia lost to Duke the committee felt some pressure to get an ACC team in there and went with Miami, and Notre Dame, was left out. So certainly, a lot of controversy surrounding that whole situation. We'll get into that more as the show moves along. Last one for you, just from a basketball perspective, Mike, is our first time talking to you since the Tennessee win. How much does that change the complexion of the non-conference schedule, and I guess how much does it boost their chances in your mind that this is a tournament team?
It helps quite a bit because we talked before the season started that this critical 4-game stretch felt like you couldn't go 0-4. And so the fact that you got kind of a rough draw for your last game in Vegas, that doesn't go well. And then you've got this bounce back game is against a top 15 team, and you win that game. I think that's huge it gives you that signature win in the non-conference, sets you up going into conference play because you shouldn't lose another game between now and then if you're a tournament team, and gives you a shot to continue to make your case. The downside is that Tennessee just lost a game to Illinois. I know Illinois is really good, but if you're a Syracuse fan, you want to root for Tennessee to be as good as they possibly can to keep their ranking high, keep their net ranking high, and make that win continue to look impressive as the season goes along.
All right, Mike. Great stuff as always.
The problem is Tennessee's not ducking anybody.
Yeah.
They've got Louisville. It's you can't blame them, but they went out and scheduled crazy.
Yeah, they did. All right, Mike. Good stuff as always. We appreciate your time. Enjoy your week, and we will chat again next Monday.
Thanks.